Hello everybody, my name is Mike Gaudet and welcome back to another installment of Top 5 Albums, the series where I walk you through my 5 favorite albums from every year. In today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at the year 1976. And I gotta say, of all of the years that I've covered up to this point, this was the one that I actually had the hardest time narrowing down to 5 albums. There were so many gems throughout 1976 that I had forgotten about, and I really had to go back and re-listen to a lot of different albums and really solidify my thoughts as to what my 5 favorites were. But after a bunch of listens and a lot of thinking, I have confidently come up with my 5 favorite albums from this year. So without further ado, here are my top 5 favorite records of 1976, starting with number 5. Coming in at number 5 is a New World record by Electric Light Orchestra. This is my second favorite album of ELO's discography and was a pivotal record for them. It was their first album cover to feature that classic ELO logo, and it also produced 3 tracks that would end up making the Billboard Top 20 hits. Stylistically, it continues to build off of the sounds that they had developed on their previous 2 records with that great mix of pop rock, orchestral pop, and progressive pop. It's 9 tracks long, and from beginning to end, I think it is incredibly consistent. The production from Jeff Lynne is top-notch. It's got amazing songwriting with all sorts of beautiful and catchy melodies, amazing instrumentation with a great string section, and all sorts of really cool and exotic synthesizer sounds. There's a great blend of different styles going from one track to the next, and it really showcases Jeff Lynne's further evolution as a songwriter. And I enjoy every single song on here, but if I had to narrow it down to a couple of favorites, I would have to go with Telephone Line, Livin' Thing, Tightrope, and So Fine. And Telephone Line is easily one of my favorite Electric Light Orchestra songs. Just such a unique composition with so much depth to it, and I just think this was an incredible album that was a creative explosion for Jeff Lynne, and it resulted in an album that would go down as my second favorite record of their entire 14-album discography. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts of ELO's entire discography, I have a video where I go through and rank all 14 of their albums, so if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out in the tier list playlist, which will be linked in the comments and in the description. And yeah, that is my number 5 album. Now on to number 4. Coming in at number 4 is Hejera by Joni Mitchell, and a few of her albums have popped up in my top 5 videos so far, and she is an artist that I hold in very high regard, and this is actually my number 1 favorite album of her entire discography. I think this record is a masterpiece. It really has everything that I want from a great Joni Mitchell record. Incredible production, awesome songwriting, really great guest features, colorful instrumentations, as well as some really incredible guitar work. And at this point in Joni's career, she had started doing that folk rock and jazz rock sort of hybrid, and I really loved the style that her writing took at this point in her discography. As far as some of the standout guest features go, we have amazing guitar work from Larry Carlton, as well as some other surprise guests like Neil Young, Victor Feldman, and Jaco Pastorius doing fretless bass on 4 tracks. And the inclusion of Jaco on some of these tracks adds such a unique and distinct sound that adds an entire another layer of depth to these tracks, and you can hear it right from the opening song of this album. And from front to back, I think this album is amazing. There is not one wasted moment throughout this 9-song track listing. The mood and style from track to track is paced very nicely, with a nice mixture of drum-centered tracks against some other songs that are a little more percussion-heavy, as well as some stripped-down ballads, and they all just complement each other so beautifully. And to me, each of these songs are just such incredible pieces of art, with all sorts of layers to them and little subtleties that really add so much character to each of these tracks. I personally think this is Joni Mitchell's most consistent album from front to back of her entire discography. And it also has a handful of songs that would make my list of favorite Joni Mitchell songs, like the opening track, Coyote, which I think has some of Jaco's best bass work of the entire album. And I also love Amelia, which has some of my all-time favorite Joni Mitchell guitar parts. And I also love the title track, Hejera, as well as Refuge of the Roads, which I think concludes the album on such an awesome note. So in my opinion, this is Joni Mitchell's best record. And if you're one of those listeners who resonates more with her earlier folk rock sorts of stylings, this might not be the album for you. But for me, as a listener, I do resonate the most with this album from a compositional and stylistic standpoint. And I think this record deserves all of the praise that it gets. And if you're interested in hearing my full thoughts on Joni Mitchell's entire discography, I also have a video ranking all of her albums, so be sure to check that out in the tier list playlist as well. And that is my number 4 album of 1976. Now on to number 3. Alright, coming in at number 3 is Arrival by ABBA. This is an absolutely beautiful record to come from this Swedish pop group. At this point in their discography, they have really settled into their sound and style and are just delivering one incredible pop track after the next, as well as incorporating some disco elements on a few tracks here and there, which is a style that was gaining a lot more traction at this point. The album is 10 tracks long, and each song just complements each other so nicely, but is also unique and distinct in its own regard. We have a really nice blend of some up-tempo driving tracks with a couple that are more feel-good and a couple that are more on the darker side, combined with some very pretty and tasteful ballads. And a couple of the tracks on here would go on to be some of ABBA's most popular songs, with the obvious one being Dancing Queen, which would go on to be a number 1 hit and would really boost their profile and help expose them to a much wider audience. And I don't think anybody would argue that that is hands down the most popular song to come from ABBA. Almost everybody has heard that track. And a couple of the other big hits to come from this record are Money, Money, Money and Knowing Me, Knowing You. And this is one of those records where as you listen through it, it almost plays through like a greatest hits album because there is just one incredible song after the next. And I'm just amazed at how stacked this 10-song track listing is. And each song contains all of the elements that I look for and love in any great ABBA song, with the really colorful and tasteful vocal melodies, the beautiful chord progressions, and the very awesome synthesizer sounds that add a whole nother layer of depth to these already amazing songs. My personal favorite songs on here would be Knowing Me, Knowing You, That's Me, Dancing Queen, Dum Dum Diddle, and the closing track, Arrival, which wraps the album up on the most beautiful note possible with such an incredible and catchy melody, and is in my opinion one of the most beautiful melodies of the entire record. And this is one of those albums where it is almost perfect from front to back, but it has one track that I'm not crazy about, unfortunately, which is track 8, titled Why Did It Have to Be Me? This is just one of those songs that stylistically is not something that I'm looking for from ABBA, with that old school rock and roll sort of vibe. And we've talked about that on previous years, where you have these albums that are almost perfect, but it has one track that's a skip over and just takes the tiniest bit away from the album. But I think the other 9 tracks on here are so incredibly strong that it really doesn't take away from the album very much, and I think it definitely is warranted for my number 3 album of 1976 and one of my favorite records of ABBA's entire discography. And I also have a video where I ranked all of their studio albums as well, so if you're interested in that, again, be sure to check out the tier list playlist in the description and the comments. So that is my number 3 album. Now on to number 2. Okay, coming in at number 2 is Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder. An absolutely amazing double album. One of my favorite double albums of all time, would easily make my top 5 favorite double album list. And his album Talking Book had popped up in my top 5 albums of 1972 list. And I really think the period between 1972 and 1976 was just a creative explosion on Stevie Wonder's part. I think it was his most prolific and most consistent period of his entire discography. Every album that he put out throughout this 4-year period was just an absolute masterpiece. And prior to making this album, Stevie Wonder had actually contemplated quitting music and moving to Ghana to work with handicapped children, but he eventually changed his mind and signed a new record contract, which would result in the release of this album. And for an album that is 17 tracks long, this is just jam-packed with so many incredible songs. Continuing in that stylistic territory that he had been exploring on the previous records, with that great mix of soul, pop, R&B, and progressive soul, but also incorporating some fusion elements now on this record, which was very surprising to hear, and I absolutely love hearing that from him. And it's got a handful of tracks that are some of Stevie Wonder's most classic songs, with Sir Duke Isn't She Lovely, I Wish, and As, which are all incredible songs. And in addition to these hits, it's got a really beautiful selection of ballads with Love's in Need of Love Today, Knocks Me Off My Feet, Joy Inside My Tears, and If It's Magic. And those are blended against some really groovy tracks like Have a Talk with God and Black Man. Then we have a couple of songs on the more progressive soul side with Village Ghetto Land, Pastime Paradise, Summer Soft, and I Am Singing. And then we have a song that's basically like a straight up instrumental fusion track with Contusion, which I think is such a cool track to put on this record. When I initially heard it, I couldn't even believe that it was Stevie Wonder, and I think hearing that side of his writing is really cool and just adds another very unique element to this very strong record. And there are so many amazing synth sounds being used all throughout this. Stevie Wonder is one of those people who was always, keeping up with the current technological advancements of the times, and that is on full display all throughout this track listing. And after the incredible 4-album stretch that he had between 1972 and 1974, it's really incredible that he still had so much great music left to continue writing. And I think on this record, he produced some of his most classic hits of all time, but also mixed them with some of the greatest B-sides that he has ever written as well. So I think this is one of the best double albums of all time, one of the best Stevie Wonder records, and my number 2 favorite album of 1976. So now for the grand reveal, here is my number 1 favorite album of 1976. Okay, for my number 1 favorite album of 1976, I picked The Royal Scam by Steely Dan. This is my personal favorite record of the Steely Dan discography, and it's actually an album that a lot of Steely Dan fans are sort of divided on. Some people rank this very high in their discography, but there are others that do tend to put it in the lower side as well. But for me and the types of sounds that I like and look for in a great Steely Dan record, I think this album delivers all of that on every front. The songwriting is top-notch. I think from front to back, it is just incredibly consistent. A perfect mix of classic Steely Dan hits with some rock-solid B-side tracks. Great instrumental writing and pairings and different combinations of guitar, piano, and keyboards, which makes for a nice dynamic sound throughout the track listing. And I think these songs are a great example of how guitar and keyboard can be paired together in a way where they don't clash and rather complement each other very nicely. And as a guitar player, this record definitely contains the largest amount of my favorite Steely Dan guitar solos from Larry Carlton, with Kid Charlemagne and Don't Take Me Alive. Kid Charlemagne is my number 1 favorite Steely Dan guitar solo, and not only that, I would also say it's one of the best rock guitar solos of all time. And I would also regard the solo in Don't Take Me Alive as one of the best intro guitar solos of all time as well. And both of those tracks would also make my list of top 5 favorite Steely Dan songs, and this is the only record of theirs to contain 2 tracks that make my top 5 list, so that's another point hugely in favor of this album. And I love every song on here, but if I had to narrow it down to a couple of other favorites, I would go with Sign In Stranger, Everything You Did, and Green Earrings, which takes on some very cool fusion-y flavors. Some other standout musical moments for me on this would be Walter Becker's guitar solo on The Fez, as well as the talk box on Haitian Divorce, which adds a really nice and surprising texture. But I love this record on all fronts. I think it is their most consistent record from front to back, and contains some of their strongest individual tracks and has the best guitar work of any Steely Dan record. And I also have a video where I rank all of their studio albums as well, so if you're interested in that, check out the tier list playlist. So that's my number 1 favorite album of 1976. So to recap, at number 5 we had A New World Record by Electric Light Orchestra. Number 4 was Hejira by Joni Mitchell. Number 3 was Arrival by ABBA. Number 2 was Songs in the Key of Life by Stevie Wonder. And number 1 was The Royal Scam by Steely Dan. If you haven't heard any of these albums and you give them a listen, please let me know what you think of them in the comments. And also be sure to let me know what your top 5 favorite albums of this year are in the comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and stay tuned for my top 5 favorite albums of 1977. I'll see you then. Take care.